Joining me now from Atlanta to discuss John Lewis's legacy is the son of Martin Luther King Jr., the human rights activist Martin Luther King III. Mr. King, 80 years of good trouble. How do you remember John Lewis?
You know, I remember John Lewis as a compassionate, a forthright, and really human rights activist who focused a lot on ensuring the right to vote would be available for all people. Whether he was in Congress, whether he was on the city council of Atlanta where he started his political career, or whether he was in India. We had an opportunity to travel to India in 2009, and my wife and I led a delegation of observing the 50th anniversary that my mother and father had come to that country. And so John Lewis was beyond a giant in terms of what he personified, bringing the best out of everyone. And he really showed us how to do that by saying, you know, I am committed to bringing about justice. And he always encouraged young people to be engaged in the fight for justice and the fight to vote and the fight to end things that were wrong in our society.
Your father bought John Lewis a bus ticket when John Lewis was 18. They got to know each other. Tell us about the relationship between the two men.
So over a period of time, of course, John Lewis, number one, was inspired by hearing Dad's messages on the radio as a young man, a young boy, actually. And that inspiration caused him later on to write a letter to Dad, and Dad, as the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott in 55 and beyond, later on becoming the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, John Lewis joined Dad in Montgomery and was asking for help and assistance. And then, of course, because he was inspired, John Lewis was involved in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee as one of its leaders. In fact, in 1965, as one of the leaders of SNCC, he and Hosea Williams, who was with SCLC, worked with my father directly, marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And of course, he was tragically beaten, but he never stopped. This is very interesting. He could have stopped then and said, you know, I didn't plan to do all of this. But he continued on that quest to set an example for all of us so that we could become a more and better and perfect union, which we certainly are not yet. But we're still working on it. That's who John Lewis is, though, a person who was dependable, a person who was well respected, a person who tried to work with people regardless of their views. He brought people together. He was a convener.
The death of George Floyd in May this year has perhaps proven that John Lewis's life's work was unfinished?
No question. The death of George Floyd proves that, and actually was the catalyst for global movements around the world. So finally, it seems that in the United States, a large number of people are engaged to say that injustice, my father used to say, is a threat to justice everywhere. I can't be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can't be what you ought to be until I'm what I ought to be, because our destinies are tied together. And so John Lewis certainly personified that as well. And the tragic death of George Floyd basically has created the prospect for a tectonic shift in the world around oppression and racism. Dad wanted to eradicate poverty, racism, and violence within our society. And these are things that we still must do. But because of what happened with George Floyd and others, I should say Breonna Taylor a few months earlier, and then of course here in Atlanta, Ahmaud Arbery, there were 3 deaths of Black men that actually helped to mobilize. But George Floyd was a personification of all of them. And it lets us know that the work of John Lewis and others is nowhere near finished.
He was still a serving congressman. He was tweeting up until a week ago, taking part in protests, and in public every time people saw him, he was steadfast. You knew him well. In private, did he ever get discouraged?
You know, I can't speak to whether or not he got discouraged. I never picked that up in my conversations with him and in my dealings with him. In fact, if you saw him at any given time, when he saw children, if he was focused on going somewhere, he always made sure that he stopped to speak to children and encouraged them to get engaged, and young people. He had a love for young people because he at one time, as my dad, was a young person and was involved in changing the nation. And so he wanted to encourage them to do the same. And so that's who he was. Every one of us will get discouraged from time to time. But no, I don't think he certainly never gave up. He used to say, we can't give up. We can't give in. We have to keep moving forward. And that's what he did. And that's what we should do as a community.
Martin Luther King III, thank you very much for your recollections.
Thank you.